One of the first things that I usually say to other practitioners who are interested in what stems and branches is, or what we teach as stems and branches, is that it's a little bit like where the 5 elements and the 6 Qi system came from. It's things that you take for granted, but you don't really realize where they come from. So it's kind of useful to say, okay, what's behind what we've been taught?
Welcome to Acupuncture West London, the podcast. This is the podcast for students, practitioners and enthusiasts of classical Chinese philosophy, Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I'm your host, Ben Carrigan, coming to your ears all the way from London. So join me as we dive deep down the rabbit hole of Chinese philosophy and into the very concepts that inform our practice. Each episode focusing on a specific topic and its application within a clinical setting. This episode is brought to you courtesy of our brand new ebook, Yin and Yang. What are Yin and Yang? What are the laws of Yin and Yang? And how are they used as defining principles for our very existence? To answer these questions and more, download your free copy at acupuncture-westlondon.com/free ebook. So in our very first episode on Yin and Yang, we discussed the Tao, the universal spark, how it gives rise to the concepts of yin and yang, and how we can move from levels of the unmanifest towards the manifest within Chinese philosophy, a journey that's profoundly rooted in Chinese numerology. Today we're going to try and take it a step further. To help me do this, I recently spoke with Deborah Woolf. Deborah has been in practice and teaching since 2000. She has studied with scholars such as Elisabeth Rocha de la Vallée, Johann de Veen, Peter van Kervel, Dr. Edward Neal, Suzanne Robidoux, Peter Firebrace, and many more. Deborah is particularly interested in classical Chinese and the classical Chinese medicine texts, with a special focus on Wu Yun Liu Qi, stems and branches. She has been a lecturer at ICOM in the UK for over 20 years, teaching Chinese medicine and philosophy, clinic and pulses. She has also taught many CPD courses on topics as varied as Chinese medicine and the chakras, intro to stems and branches, and Chinese characters for the Zhang Fu. Without further ado, let's get stuck in. Hi, Deborah. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, hi, Ben. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm really delighted to have you here because the first episode I did a couple of weeks back, I spoke about yin and yang and I touched on numerology. Obviously the number 1 and the Tao, which we can't really speak about. And then number 2, yin and yang, duality, the balance of 2 opposing forces, etc. And I worked my way down through 3 until 5. I left out 6, which is probably some sort of cardinal sin, but I did. So with that in mind, I wanted to see if we could touch on yin and yang a little bit and maybe discuss numerology and go down from 1 to 6 if we can, and maybe touch on stems and branches a little bit and how that fits in as the mother of 5-element acupuncture.
Okay.
So I sent you some questions during the week. The first question I asked you was, obviously we can't talk about the number 1 being the Tao, but I mentioned the number 2 and I mentioned yin and yang as static concepts. And then I mentioned the number 3 as yang, qi and yin. So I talked about the number 3 being the first level where yang and yin have a relationship facilitated through the movement of qi. And it's through that relationship that 4, 5 and 6 and onwards can manifest. But I don't think you sort of resonated with that. So can you say exactly why?
Yeah, I mean, I had a problem with the idea of yin and yang being static concepts for a start. Because, well, they're not, are they? It's always to do with movement and change and transformation. And in fact, the way that they define the cosmological beginning of the universe is about, the clear Qi rises and the turbid Qi descends, and, the clear becomes the heavens and the turbid becomes the earth. So they're already made out of substances that are in constant change and transformation and are separating sort of naturally from one end to the other. So, and whenever you talk about yin or yang, actually, I think it's a real problem to talk about it as being sort of just one thing, one separate entity. That's why we have the Taiji too, the 2 fishes picture or whatever you want to call it, with the yin and yang, sort of interlinked, is that they're always in constant interconnected reaction or action, if you want. So 2 and 3 are actually the same thing. You can't really talk about just one, just yin, just yang, without immediately talking about the way that they interact. And the way they interact we call qi. Or you could say that the way they interact we call humans, because you've got heaven, you've got earth, and then the interaction is humans. Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about something like the Tao, or if we want to talk in Western terms like the Big Bang, there is going to be movement involved. But I think I just thought in terms of creating a narrative where you're looking at a narrative for an expansion or a progression within the number one, I guess. Wouldn't that be right?
But again, it's not an expansion though, is it? It's an expansion and a contraction. Even when you talk about the Big Bang, that's two, and two is immediately three.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think this is the thing where I've tried very hard to, put rings around things. But I guess for me, when I think of three and I think of qi facilitating the relationship between the two and that movement, when we talk about the macrocosm and the microcosm, you see that kind of relationship between yang qi and yin, or heaven, man and earth, or shen qi and jing, or fire, earth and water. You see those down through the various levels. I guess that's where I've made those connections.
Yeah. And I know that it's, we try and conceptualize. It's, that's why, you said just now, well, we can't talk about one, the Tao, whatever, the Tao that can't be named and all that kind of stuff. And well, you can't, but you sort of have to in some way.
Yeah.
Even when you talk about one, you have to talk about the oneness that is the one, if you see what I mean. So already you're kind of talking about one, but you're not talking about one. You're talking about a totality. And then within that totality, there is separation. And it's not necessarily movement, but transformation. And that transformation allows there to be, some stuff that is clearer, yang, and some stuff that is turbid, dense, yin, or heaven or earth. And then immediately, they're not separate entities. They're always constantly relating to each other. Just like in the I Ching, you have the first hexagram is Qian, which is heaven, or the initiative, the initiator. And then the second one is earth, Kun, which is the receiving or the responding. Do you see what I mean? Already the way they describe them is talking about two things that are constantly in interaction. And that's why we can never say that something is too yang, or only yin. We always have to say, it's part of a sort of a constant continuum, if you want, a constant interaction.
Of course, yeah. One thing I mentioned in the first episode, I was paraphrasing something that Elizabeth Ruscha de la Vallée wrote, which was, in Western culture and mathematics, although 1 and 1 make 2, and the character for 2 looks akin to writing 1 twice, the character for 2 strokes on top of one another, does not in any way symbolize 2 times 1. 1 is representative of everything and can absolutely not be doubled or duplicated. The 2 strokes representing the number 2 should therefore be considered symbolically as the opening of the 1, as distinction within unity. The 2 strokes represent a necessary parting, but do not break the common belonging of the 2 elements.
Yeah.
So, I really resonated with that.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, because it's easy to think of one like a pyramid, everything kind of expanding outwards from one, where you have one at the top and it comes outwards, because that's kind of the way we think of it in Western thought. 1 is like the smallest number, whereas actually 1, when we talk about it, is the greatest number.
Yeah, it's like the universal void out of which everything can come.
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
a void emptiness, but a void that is full, that can make everything come out. I love the way that Dr. Ed Neal talks about it, because he always talks everything about being breath cycles. So, inherently the moment that you talk about qi, you're always talking about the idea of a breath cycle. So it's kind of like, expansion and contraction, one whole breath cycle. And so that encompasses the yin aspect and the yang aspect, but it's also talking about qi, movement, transformation.
Yeah, and I love using those words, expansion and contraction, because then we're really talking about the universe, aren't we? I guess obviously one thing we all have to think about, which is something you mentioned in your Qiological interview, about how, we're always dealing with translations. I think there's the Vietnamese and French to English, isn't that right?
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful with the words we use, because it can be so easy with philosophical concepts to grab onto words that we have in English, which don't necessarily mean the same thing or have the same context at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the whole idea about Qi, you'll notice that nowadays people don't translate it. They just put Qi because, there've been so many discussions about how to translate it. It's ridiculous.
I
It's
know.
definitely not just energy. Let's put it that way.
It's so funny because as a young practitioner myself, I often get asked in clinic, what is yang and yin and what's qi? And part of me cringes because you end up going down this rabbit hole of trying to explain, and then you hear yourself mention the word heaven, and you go, oh God, why did I say that?
Yeah.
And people kind of glaze over and go, oh Christ, what? And you don't think they're going to come back, and they do come back, which is great. But
surprising, yeah.
it really surprises me every time,
Me too. Or I'm rabbiting on about the seasons or something, and I'm just looking at them going, oh my God, why did I start this? There's got to be a better way of doing it.
Because there's no end to it, is there? Because you can't kind of, once you've opened Pandora's box, there's just...
Yeah. And, I think, again, it's like talking about problems in translation is that, the character Tien, which is translated as heaven, I mean, it means sky, it means the weather, it means heaven, it means the ancestors. It's got so many different meanings. Do you know what I mean? And then we sort of shorthand it and say heaven. And then in our culture, of course, heaven has got all those connotations that are not the same connotations that it has, that the Chinese character has in classical Chinese. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot all the time, as far as I'm concerned.
And actually, from our context as well, if we talk about earth, it has the same sort of thing, because isn't it two is earth, which is soil?
Well, yeah, earth is already two different characters in itself, and then we're always shooting ourselves in the foot there. I mean, this is one of those things I've got a real bee in my bonnet about when I'm teaching.
Sure.
Even like last weekend when I was teaching the Zhang Fu Chinese character thing, I was talking about the fact that you've got these two different characters, and one is heaven as opposed to earth, heaven and earth, which is that duality, two that isn't really two. It's like the oneness that is divided into these two different parts sort of thing that are in constant interaction. And then there's the other character, which is to do with what we call the five phases or the five elements. And that one's at a completely different level. It's at the level of five. It's not at the level of the duality, heaven, earth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so confusing because in the first episode on yin and yang, I was trying to talk a little bit about heaven, man, and earth. And then actually, I can't even remember. I'm getting confused even talking about it now. So therein lies the problem.
Well, also, I mean, it is difficult, even when you talk about three, and then, I end up, sometimes when I'm teaching, I think, oh God, why did I start this? This is just a nightmare. I'm just leading people up the garden path. But yeah, because you're sort of talking about heaven, earth and man, and heaven, man and earth, so it's three, but it's got two different orders. And, one of them's to do with creation and the other one's to do with, after creation. So more the created world. They're very different concepts. And again, we can just mangle them together,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess to move on briefly, one of the things I wanted to get to, I guess, is at ICOM, Wu Yun Liu Qi, or Stems and Branches, is a core part of the curriculum in the third year. I guess it's what ICOM has become known for. I didn't really know much about it before I studied at ICOM myself, but it's become a staple of my own clinic now, and it's probably my favorite part of clinic. I love doing people's charts, so I find it quite, cathartic. But also the patterns that I see with people, and, obviously I remember always being told, don't try and force the chart on the person. Mm-hmm. But when you sit back and look at it and you think, wow, this makes so much sense, or you can put it beside your case history and look at it and go, wow, it blows my mind. But often other practitioners or students from other lineages, or even my patients, ask what it is. And I'm stumped to try and explain it to them without going into the heaven, earth, man thing. Is there a way that you can do this to help me out?
Well, you want me to explain it without the heaven, earth, man thing? Wow, that is going to be hard.
No, you can do it any way you like. It's just, I end up saying a kind of a sentence, and then I kind of end up talking for 5 minutes, and then sort of getting quieter and quieter, and then sort of
tailing off.
Just tail off, yeah, in a sort of running out of steam kind of way.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Okay, I'll give it a go. So I do have to talk about heaven, earth and man.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I mean, one of the first things that I usually say to other practitioners who are interested in what stems and branches is, or what we teach as stems and branches, because I don't think we can say that this is the totality of stems and branches, is that it's a little bit like where the 5 element and the 6 Qi system came from. So actually, it's always surprising to me when I'm teaching our final year students that, I try and kind of make it clear that some of the stuff that I'm talking about, we actually talked about in the first year and the second year. And that it's things that you take for granted, but you don't really realize where they come from. So it's kind of useful to say, okay, this is actually what's behind what we've been taught. So I approach it on the lines of, I'm trying to show you the basis of what we've been taught. And I usually say that, this is because I was trained as a mathematician, and mathematicians absolutely hate having to swallow things just because they've been told that that's the way it is. They want to find out why. So that's kind of a good way to get into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because I guess that's exactly how I found. I found when we were in third year and you'd introduced us to stems and branches, and suddenly, I think in first and second year, there were certain concepts we were told, don't dive too deeply into this at the moment. It'll all become clear. It's like the sort of waiting for a punchline or something. Do you know what I mean? And it was like that, where you go, oh, wow, this really is the core of 5-element acupuncture. And so many of the protocols that people may use in TCM or whatever, but they just don't know why. Yeah. And for me, I'm very much the same. I can't claim to be a mathematician, like I think we discussed briefly earlier, but I do need to know how things work. And I think the most important thing is that, obviously if we're dealing with any philosophical element, there's always going to be different translations or different ways to look at things. Not everyone's going to agree, but I think it's important for all of us to try and hold as many, which might be seemingly conflicting things in our minds, to try and make sense of them in different contexts in our own way or in our own practice.
Well, I mean, there's also that level of boredom. I think that if you're taught in the way that you have to just memorize, if you see somebody who's got this, then you've got to do this. If you see somebody who's got this, then you've got to do that. Then I would guess that at least I would become very, very bored very, very quickly. And I don't think I'd want to be an acupuncturist anymore, to be honest. So I like to use my mind a little bit. I like to sort of, use my mind and my hands, not just follow instructions. I'm not very good at following people's instructions. And the other thing is that Chinese medicine is such a layered story. Things are not just chucked out at a certain point because we got this new theory which makes much more sense, so let's get rid of the previous theory because blah blah blah. There's layers upon layers upon layers, and this is difficult because, especially for us Westerners, because we want to put it in the box. We want to link things together, and we often don't realize that there's like a massive historical time gap between one concept and another, and we're putting them together in the same box.
Yeah,
I think that's called teleological thinking, where you just want to kind of like make it all kind of work together in some way. And, it doesn't work like that. So I definitely buy into the idea of understanding different ways of treatment, because different ways of treatment are appropriate to different patients at different times. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also the idea of really trying to, mostly for the last 20 plus years, what I've tried to do is to try and work my head into trying to think in a similar way to the ancient Chinese did, or the medieval Chinese, if you want, because I think if I can think in that way, then I can understand what they've written much better, and then maybe I can be a better practitioner.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been trying to read some of the classics and dip in and out of various chapters and make sense of them. But then when I went to look at a lot of the stuff about stems and branches, particularly chapter 72, it wasn't there.
No, because chapter 72 and 73 were so-called lost chapters. And so historically, they were actually supposedly put back in much later. It was maybe in the Tang or the Song dynasty, something like that. And they aren't necessarily what they originally had. Originally, they only had, because they were lost in inverted commas, then they only had the titles. And I think they were sort of rewritten by somebody and then stuffed back in there. So Unshaw decided it probably wasn't worth translating them because they don't have the seal of approval.
I see. Okay, yeah, that makes
So
sense. Yeah, because I
pretty
think I
weird.
found a Henry Liu copy, and then there was the Ni copy, which is less of a translation, like we discussed, I think, and
Yeah.
more of an interpretation. But I guess that's going to happen with anything you're reading in English, isn't it?
Yeah, well, is it translation or is it translation plus opinion? And, of
Yeah,
course you can put your opinion in, but you just need to be clear about which bit is your opinion so that, people who read it don't take that as being the translation.
absolutely. Yeah.
Mm. And yeah, there is definitely a Henry Liu translation of chapters 72 and 73. But I mean, to be honest, I haven't really spent much time with those because they're not part of the stems and branches chapters, even though, because of the fact that they've been put in later. And the corpus of the stems and branches chapters is Suen 66 to 71 and then 74. And those were all placed interpolated by Wang Bing. So anything that's kind of after that, I tend to ignore it because I'm and there's this kind of like strange textual history for chapters 72 and 73. So I feel a bit nervous about them. Don't really want to go there, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. Because I think I read those. Well, when I say I read them, I think for my dissertation, I was reading through a lot of those chapters, and then more recently, I've been reading, I think, Nanjing 33.
Mm-hmm.
Which was very much about the Ke cycle. I can't exactly remember the content now because it's quite a short chapter, but yeah, it's really interesting to get into.
I think the Nanjing is fascinating, actually, to be honest. And the Ke cycle is really interesting because I always assumed in my teleological way that that of course once they had 5 phases or 5 elements or whatever that the Shang cycle came before the Ke cycle, but actually the Ke cycle is the one that historically was first talked about. And the Shang cycle came quite a lot later. Yeah, weird, isn't it?
Oh, I didn't know that at all. Wow. Gosh.
Yeah, and it was to do with dynastic succession. So they were talking about, this guy, he was because he was I don't know, he wore black and, he did kind of watery things or whatever. And so then the next one had to be wearing yellow and doing earthy things because the earth controls the water and so on and so forth. It's not the right order, I'm sorry, but, that was the idea.
Wow. Okay. Gosh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Because you do see the Ke cycle a lot in using stem points and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, the whole relationship of the stems is completely related to Ke cycle relationships, actually. So that makes total sense.
Okay. Yeah. So in terms of stems and branches, we're talking about the relationship between heaven and earth and space and time, aren't we? But I'm always careful to say this because from what I've seen, it can be contextual, which is a word I hate using because it can be a sort of a get out of jail free clause. But when you're talking about the stems, they're heavenly. And when you're talking about the branches, they're earthly. And the stems are at the level of 5 and the branches are at the level of 6. But then if you were to talk about things like the 5 heavenly palaces or the planets, that's a level of heaven. But then the stems would be at the level of earth, and then the elements, the 5 elements or the Zhang Fu would be at the level of man. So it's something that always gets me a little bit.
I think it's quite useful for me. I find it really helpful to think about resonance. Mm-hmm. So, which is right up your street, Ben, I would have thought, with your musical background. This is cool. Surely, correct me if I get this all wrong and I use the wrong words. So I'm in the heavens, meaning the outer heavens, like the cosmos and what we call space. Yeah. Then we have the planets and the stars, and there's an underlying understanding or sort of assumption in Chinese thought, in Chinese philosophy, in Chinese thought generally that the heavens and the earth and everything around humans follows a particular order. An order, a principle, and that order and principle is to do with numbers. This is that Qi Shu thing that we've talked about before. Yeah. It's that kind of level of 3 where you've got Li, which is like the heavenly principle, or it's like the graining pattern of the universe, or, like the lines in the jade or in the wood that tells you how to carve it to bring out the best of it, something like that maybe. And Shu just means numbers. So there's a fundamental understanding that, the universe moves with number and principle.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about Qi Shu. I used to get a little bit confused because when we talk about yin and yang, we have the laws of yin and yang, how we might perceive them in clinic. I guess they keep us on track in terms of yang can transform into yin and yang controls yin, yin supports yang, all these kind of things. But then we have Qi Shu. We talk about it's the order that defines yin and yang, or how they move, should I say. Is there sort of a crossover there, or are they very separate?
I think Qi Shu is a very fundamental concept. It's basically a fundamental understanding that everything in our cosmos, be it in the heavens, being on Earth, on our Earth, and in our bodies, everything moves, everything transforms, everything happens following number and principle. And that's why then when you look at the laws of yin and yang, then of course, they're also going to follow these number and principle sort of laws, if you want. It's like another manifestation of Qi Shu, if you want.
Okay, so we're talking maybe different levels as such.
Yeah, for instance. Yeah.
Okay.
So having sort of accepted the idea that there's this kind of heavenly order, or that the heaven initiates things and then the earth responds to this order. So we have this idea about things that are in heaven that start stuff off, and things that are on earth that are kind of responding to what the heaven does. That's back to the two hexagrams or trigrams, Qian, heaven, and Kun, earth, for instance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one initiates and the other one responds. And then you get into all that kind of like terrible translation where, heaven is man and man is active, and earth is female and female the passive. I hate that. So I'm not going to go there on that one.
Okay, no worries.
Just want to say I'm not doing that one.
Okay.
So if I were to talk about what's happening in the heavens, and I'm talking, out there in space, we've got planets and we've got stars, we've got the outer cosmos, and they follow some kind of order and principle. There's like the cosmic breath, or the universal spark, or the Big Bang, or, however you want to translate it, I don't really mind. But basically there is a constant movement of contraction and expansion and contraction and expansion. And this is qualified when they talk about the heavenly stems in these Wu Yun Liu Qi chapters of the Huangdi Neijing Suwen. They talk about it, these movements, this universal cosmic breath, or whatever you want to call it, as the music or the frequencies or the vibration of the planets.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Or maybe not the planets, but some kind of, it was probably the visible planets. So you have these 5 different visible planets, and they're, which we also have in, normal astronomy. They're the visible planets. There's 5 of them. And there's this idea that, they can be expanding, or they can be contractive, or they can be excess or deficient, or, there's all sorts of different terms for them. But basically, because there's 5 of them, and then they've got 2 different states, more or less, or however you want to call it, active or passive or whatever, that gives you these kind of 10 stem qualities, and they're called the 10 heavenly stems.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
And those 10 stem qualities, that same vibration, that same frequency, that same resonance, because, everything moves with number and principle. There's this kind of thing that whatever happens in the heavens, also we're a reflection. Humans are like a physical, energetic manifestation of what happens in space and in time, if you want. So those heavenly stems, those 10 different qualities, those 10 different types of breath work, whatever you want to call them, vibration, resonance, they're mapped inside our body as the 10 Zhang Fu organs, which is everything except the so-called pericardium and Sanjiao, the 3-heater.
That's right, because that's post-heavenly.
Yeah, because, things to do in heaven, things to do with stems. This heavenly order is to do with what happens before you're born. And they're very much linked to, the cycle of the development of the 10 organs, when you're in the womb and all that kind of stuff.
So that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you to Deborah Woolf for joining me today. Stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Deborah, which is also available now. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about Deborah and her Brighton-based clinic, Anahata, check out anahatahealth.co.uk. For questions about today's episode, of which I'm sure there are many, I'd love to hear from you. So get in touch. podcast at acupuncture-westlondon.com. Lastly, don't forget to check out the show notes at acupuncture-westlondon.com/podcast. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review. To keep up to date with all of our upcoming episodes, sign up to our podcast newsletter. By doing so, you'll get your very own copy of my brand new ebook, Yin and Yang. Check out acupuncture-westlondon.com/free ebook. See you next time.